This series is called Tents and Thresholds. We're looking at narrative agency and divine encounters with matriarchs in Genesis. Last week, we stood in the garden with Eve and glimpsed what it was like to see creation as a womb. We explored how God gives life, not as a distant architect, but as a mothering presence, forming, birthing, nurturing, and breathing humanity into being. Eve, the first mother, called the mother of all living, bore the weight of both promise and pain for humanity's future. And from her story, we saw how the divine image includes these tasks of motherhood, such as nurture, risk, and generative power. Today, we leave the garden behind and move into a new place. Genesis turns a page from Earth's fertility to family lines. And the rest of the book of Genesis is the narrative about a family line. And at the heart of this promise, surprisingly, are not just patriarchs and kings, but matriarchs. And this is where our tents and threshold theme begins to take shape. These women live in tents, literally, and run their households and families in tents, but they also live on the threshold between freedom and enslavement, privilege and exile, divine blessing and human brokenness. And just like Eve, Sarah and Hagar are not footnotes to the story. They are the story. Their actions provide tension, turning, and theology. So today we're going to ask, what does it mean to bear a covenant as a mother? What happens at the intersection of doubt and faith, and how survival can become a sacred act? And where is God really when we have one woman laughing in a tent at the prospect of pregnancy and menopause, and another weeping in the wilderness? While Genesis 12 through 24 includes many important narratives about Abraham, who follows God into a strange land and takes action to survive in that land, leading a very large family of wealth, prosperity, property, and people. And at the height of the story, how Abraham will become the patriarch of a great people through a promised covenant from God, we also see what Phyllis Tribble wrote in a 20th century book called Texts of Terror, that no mighty patriarch is Abram, especially in chapter 16, where he is a silent, acquiescent, and minor figure in a drama between two women. And that is indeed what we will pick up in this story. Before Isaac is born, an Egyptian woman named Hagar bears Abraham's first son. Their stories overlap. Sarah's privilege defines Hagar's suffering, and Hagar's faith defines Sarah's covenant, and both become mothers of nations in the Bible. Sarah and Hagar and their actions are at the moral center of Genesis 16 through 21, and this in a way continues the legacy of Eve. So to give you a little bit of narrative framework, Isaac will be the next patriarch in the covenant lineage in the Bible. But another son is born to Abraham first. His name is Ishmael. God is not exclusively devoted to those who are called to be part of the covenant, and that is something we learn explicitly through Hagar's story. Hagar is an Egyptian. She's acquired probably through the events in chapter 12, where Abraham and Sarah come before the Pharaoh, and they end up walking away with a lot of Egyptian property and people and servants. So this whole story becomes a kind of role reversal from a future story in Exodus, where the Egyptians will enslave descendants of Abraham. But right now, we have, in service and enslavement to the family of Abraham, an Egyptian. The two women in these stories, Hagar and Sarah, are not parallel. Their lives are complexly intertwined. Sarah's privilege gives her opportunity, and she's called to a covenant that she has not chosen, but she is chosen to succeed in. But Hagar has very little agency and choice in the matter. She's a pawn in Sarah's world. In the end, she does choose to turn to God. find a relationship there. Both women's actions drive the story forward. They both contribute to the covenant and to knowledge about who God is regarding the covenant. And Abraham has some agency in stories and conversations, but in the larger narrative, Abraham is mostly a passive character narratively. That means actions happen to him, and he often acquiesces to the things that happen. God's covenant then with Abraham in this story, as you'll see, is not the only covenant that happens in this narrative. In the same way that God speaks with Abraham, in fact, directly after God promises Abraham to be the father of nations, God also speaks with Hagar in the very next passage and blesses her and promises her to be the mother of nations, and her son will extend that heritage on. And this shows us that God has called Abraham and Sarah to a covenant whose story we read on to the Hebrew people, but God has not made an exclusive contract with these people. God has also decided to bless other people. And so maybe for the first time, but certainly not for the last time, we see that God does not have a preference of ethnicity of one over the other. God cares about people, and God's ear is constantly turned to those who are on the margins. And Hagar is a really detailed example of that. So even though we often read these chapters through the lens of Abraham's calling, we're going to shift perspectives and follow the narrative action of the story. So we're going to begin with Sarah, not just as Abraham's wife, but as a woman who's negotiating identity, power, and promise. Sarah's name at the beginning of the story is Sarai. That I ending means my, it's possessive. And her name changes to Sarah, which gives her name a kind of broader generalness, if that makes sense. But Sar is a word you've probably heard before, like the root of the word Sar, and you've probably heard the word Sarim, meaning princes or rulers. And the root of this word is ruler. And in this age, the biggest name in the time period that this may have been happening that had to do with Sar was Sargon of Akkad, who was a famous ancient king, whose beginning of his name, Sar, is the same root for the name for Sarah. So Sarai, meaning my ruler, becomes Sarah, meaning the ruler. And she gets this grandiose title of rulership and leadership. The word Sar is used in the Hebrew Bible to usually describe kings and even kings on the level with gods. So it's a very powerful symbol. And I want to define her name in this term, even though you probably have heard of her name defined more as princess, because the early readers of the Bible didn't have Disney sitting in front of them, and we do. So I think we should think about the significance of the name of Sarah, maybe removing that Cinderella dress for a minute. Sarah is defined as not a mother the first time we meet her in Genesis 11. Her feature is that she has not become a mother, and that becomes her main identity through the text. Her relationship to matriarchy is her primary identity in this story. She is called also Abraham's woman. And I mentioned this last week, that often in the Bible, we don't get the term for wife, which in the ancient world, there is a term for wife, but it has a kind of subservient meaning. Whereas instead, we see more of this language of my woman, my man, this more egalitarian relationship between men and women, especially in the earlier biblical texts. So that's something that was culturally shifted. Abraham leverages her beauty. We know she was beautiful in chapter 12. Abraham is so afraid that she will be taken away and that he will be killed because he's married to a beautiful wife, so that someone else can have her, that he asks her to claim that she's his half-sister so that he won't have to fear for his life, which is a complicated story, but we're not going to look into it too much because this is a story about Abraham's lies and outcomes. But it is a story that tells us a little bit about Sarah, that she was beautiful, that many people wanted to be with her and wanted to be around her. And her name change signals a shift from an individual status to a covenant identity. So she goes from Abraham's princess or leader or ruler in the family and the home to a matriarch or leader of great nations. And much like that, Abram's name is changed to Abraham. And that name shift is a shift from the name for father to the name for all father or great father. And so their names shift as a signal of the covenant. And this is the first time we see this, but it's not the last time that we'll see names shift to represent a covenant with God. God promises Abram and Sarah many descendants in Genesis 15. God outlays their future. They will be oppressed. They will be enslaved. They will be foreigners in a land not their own, but they will inherit all of the land. The descendants of Abram will inherit all the land between Egypt and Mesopotamia. And so that is the promise of God. But even after this promise, we're told in chapter 16, verse 1, that Sarah has no children. She is still marked by the sign that she is not a mother. In her custom, she is old, but we think she still can bear. This whole story is shrouded in some ambiguity about her age. She cannot imagine experiencing, the word there is used, the pleasure that a woman experiences. So she may be menopausal, she may be, I don't know, just in a stage of life where she can't get there. But all of that to say, whatever her biological reasoning is, she's very fearful, and fear begins to drive the actions of Sarah. And I think this is where things kind of turn dark in this story. It has been 10 years, and accordingly, some laws would allow Abraham to divorce her and remarry legally because she has not been able to provide children. And children, this is not subject to an idea of romance or being in love. This is about a socioeconomic reality that if you don't have children and you have wealth and property, as Abraham did, you can't pass it on. And the stakes become higher for this kind of legacy as time goes on, because it's not just your property and your wealth, but it's also your family legacy and your family story. And part of that is keeping your God alive and present in the land. And this becomes an important feature later in biblical texts. So Sarah takes action within the norms of her society. In Genesis 16, accordingly with different laws we read about in the Nuzi tablets that shows a practice in northern Mesopotamia of surrogacy. We also can read in the Code of Hammurabi, talk about a barren wife legally giving another woman, a maid or a servant, to her husband to fulfill surrogacy, and that child would then belong to the woman who is the first wife. So again, this is a socioeconomic status thing, but it's a justification of what we would call polygamy. And unlike in maybe every other place in the Bible where parents find a wife for a man or God finds a wife for a man, in this case, we have a wife finding a wife for a man. So it's a very unique story in this situation, but Sarah seems to be a very practical person, and she wants to see this covenant fulfilled, and she has found a way to see this covenant fulfilled within the norms, the legal norms of her society. And so she goes to Abraham and says, we have this servant. She probably came for whatever reason. Maybe she was running away from her own home life, or maybe she was transferred from someone else's property or household. She's in their household with many others. Sarah sets eyes on her and says, why don't you sleep with this girl? She can have a baby, probably a young teenager. Then we can see to God's promise. Well, unlike in every other story about Abraham that we've seen so far, Abraham doesn't seem to need to pray about this. He's just like, yeah, sure, okay. And he's happy to proceed with this task that his wife has given him. So this is like maybe the first time I think that we've seen, beside the incident in Egypt where he asked Sarah to be his half-sister, this is the first time where we see Abraham acquiesce and act passively without talking to God about what he should do and how he should proceed in this matter. Well, Sarah gets jealous because Hagar does get pregnant right away. And Sarah blames God first, and then she blames Abraham, and then she blames Hagar because she can't get out of her head, and she wants to know what's going on, I'm sure. So in chapter 21, Sarah finally bears a son. She names him Isaac, named Laughter. If you know an earlier part of the story, she laughs in response to this thought of giving birth. Maybe she thought it was a joke that she should have a child in her older age. Maybe she thought it was a great joy to have a child in her older age. Whatever it is, she names him Laughter, Yitzhak in the Hebrew. And she demands then, shortly after Isaac is born, that Hagar and Ishmael, Hagar's son, be sent away. Now, Ishmael is probably a young boy, and Abraham has clearly grown close to his son, that Abraham celebrated greatly when he was weaned, meaning he probably, from that time on, from the time he was a toddler on, hung out with his dad and learned how to do things around the farm and learned about agriculture life and was an active participant. He was probably a hunter. He grows up to be an archer, we know. So he was probably involved with learning a lot and being mentored in this large household. And not least of all, Abraham is called to be circumcised and to circumcise his household. And so Ishmael and Abraham go through this very intense and traumatic procedure together with their whole household. So there's a bond between the two. So it's not surprising that when Sarah asks Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away because she doesn't want him around being a older son to her son, to the covenant son, that he does seem to pray about it, because then we get a word from God and God says, go ahead and do what Sarah asks of you. So with Abraham and God being kind of passive to Sarah's actions in this case, but Abraham does send them out with provisions for a while and they go out. Abraham is also promised he will be blessed, that his son Ishmael will be blessed as the father of many and a father of a great nation. So again, we see the covenant is a particular thing for a particular people, but God's blessing is not restrained or restricted by that covenant. We don't hear from Sarah again. Sarah disappears completely from the narrative. We'll talk a little bit about the implications of that in an important story when I talk about Hagar. But Sarah disappears until her death in Genesis 23. She's not even there for the Akedah, the binding of Isaac in chapter 22. She's not present when Abraham attempts to sacrifice her son. She's just silent, and we don't know what she's doing or where she is or how she is. But she has moved to Hebron. She moved to a different land. When she dies, Abraham has to travel to her because he lives in a different place. So it's an interesting implication. You'll have to fill in the gaps for what has happened in that family, but I'll talk about some ideas in a minute. So a couple notes before I move on to Hagar. Sarah's privilege as a matriarch contrasts sharply with Hagar's vulnerability in this story. Sarah's actions lead to harm for Hagar and her son. And one thing to notice here is that the covenant promise for Sarah does not erase or cover up human injustice in this story. Sarah's actions and Abraham's actions are held accountable. So even though they are called to a promise that is greater in the narrative, and this is the story of the covenant with the Abrahamic family and lineage, the injustice of these actions are not erased. In fact, they're called attention to, and God is present in both of these stories and exposes the injustice. So there's a little bit of theological irony in the story. So now that we've looked a little bit at Sarah's agency from the center of a place of power and of calling, of privilege and wealth, let's follow the story outward to the margins. Hagar, who is known now by some religious groups as Mother Hagar, she is not first defined as a mother or not a mother. She is first defined as a slave and as a surrogate. Her name comes from the root Hagar, the one who was dragged away. And it carries the same roots as foreigner or alien. She is the foreigner, she is the alien, she's the oppressed in the story, and her name represents it. So while Sarah is a ruler, Hagar is the one who is subject to pain. Both have children that become great nations because of the promise of a God who delivers blessings. But they come from extremely opposite situations and backgrounds. So we learn first, the same time in chapter 16 that we learn that Sarah has not given birth to a child, we learn that Hagar is an Egyptian slave. Hagar becomes Abraham's second wife, also called his woman. So there is no distinction between the two. They are both wives. And at this time, it's hard to say because there's so many questions about when Genesis was written, and there's no timeline that we get for when these stories take place. We don't get any grounded historical time setting until into Exodus, probably somewhere in the first early chapters of Exodus. We get a little bit of historical grounding that aligns up with some Egyptian stelas and artifacts that we have that present them in a historical framework, if that makes sense. But for Genesis, we have the story of a family lineage and the stories that those families told about their ancestors. And we don't have a clear time segment. But in this story and in the stories of the other patriarchs and matriarchs in Genesis, it seems that polygamy was a normal and accepted way of living. So that's the first reality. So Hagar, when she's offered this opportunity, we don't know how she sees it. We know she's young. She's probably a teenager. She's probably 16, let's say, for our imagination's sake. She's offered this opportunity. She may be very fearful of this opportunity. She also may see it as an opportunity to step into some legacy and heritage. It's a socioeconomic step up, and that would have been a normal way for her to see this. She is afraid after all of this first happens, and her fear drives her straight to God. And until now, we've seen Abraham converse with God and have conversations and negotiate and argue with God even, but we haven't really seen that relationship with anyone else. Hagar has a conversation with God. And this happens just after God has promised Abraham the covenant promise of a nation of children. Just after that, Hagar has a very similar conversation with God. So when Hagar runs off to the wilderness, we see God act. God sees, God hears, and God provides. And this becomes a basis for what theologians call theology from the margins. Where is God acting that's not center stage? God speaks to Hagar, initiates conversation, says, Hagar, slave girl or servant girl of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? And she says back to God, I'm running away from my mistress. And God tells her that she's pregnant and that her child is going to grow to be a very wild and unruly man. A wild donkey of a man is the phrase used in the Bible, although some translations say zebra. So take from that what you will. Ishmael, who is not named after an action, not named like Isaac was named after laughter. Ishmael is from the root that makes up the name for Samuel, like Samuel the prophet. It means God hears. And that's what Hagar experiences in this moment, is God hearing and God seeing her. And this is really an interesting literary thing because Hagar is an Egyptian in this situation, and she's oppressed and enslaved and outcast, and God sees her and God hears her. And then just a book away from this, in Exodus 2, we're going to see the Egyptians as a powerful nation and the Hebrew people, the descendants of Abraham, as enslaved and in service to Egypt. And in chapter 2, verse 24, we're going to see that God sees them and hears them. And so what we see here is a stage set for a God who sees and hears those who are crying out under oppression. We don't get that action from God about people in the center of power, probably because they don't need it. They don't need that extension of power and action. But it is an interesting thing, and it's throughout the Bible that God sees and hears those who have need and those who live on the margins. So Hagar responds to this in chapter 16 and says, have I really seen God and stayed alive after seeing? So she's feeling small, but then she names a well at that place for God, and she names God, and she becomes the first person to give God a name in the Bible. She calls God El Roi, the God who sees me. And in this way, some have said she's the first theologian, although I would argue that Eve is also trying to theologize morality with divine beings. So far, Hagar is living out that legacy by naming God. She receives from God, and she recognizes that God is a being who's active and has agency in her world, and she gives God a name, and then she names a well to leave that. So she can't write a book and publish it and leave it in a library, but she can name a well, and that becomes an act of power and an act of legacy for her. She then returns because God suggests that she should return, and she bears a son, and they name the son Ishmael. Then Sarah has a son, and this is a joyous moment, and I think she names him Isaac because she is overjoyed, and she is pleased at this. But it's not long until Sarah's jealousy begins to creep in, her fear creeps in, and she acts very consistently with her character. She's a little one-dimensional with distrust. She asks that Hagar is sent out, and as I mentioned before, Abraham must have sought God's counsel, because then we get God responding to Abraham in a large chunk of passage saying, go ahead, send her out. He packs provisions. I imagine this was a super emotional thing. We only get it in a few verses, but it would have had to be hard for him to send his first son away. And however he felt about Hagar, whether she was in the picture as for daily interaction or not, I think the relationship between Abraham and Ishmael must have been deep. So they're banished, but they run out of provisions at some point. And the next thing we know in the story, Hagar's in the wilderness again. And she is devastated, and she sees that her boy's going to die. And this is traumatic. And for anyone who's lost a child, I think this passage is so complex. But she takes her son and she lays him down because she doesn't want to watch him die. And so she goes, what the text says, a bow's shot away, which foreshadows a little bit that Ishmael, spoiler alert, does live. And he grows up to be an archer, a bowman. And so when she tells this story, as this story is told, she's telling it in those terms. I put him and I went a bow's shot away. And so she goes away and she's crying. She's just crying under the pain and the suffering of what she's going through. And her son is dying and she has no family around her any longer. And the text says that God hears the cries of the boy and goes to Hagar and says, what are you doing? I have told you that I'll bless you. Like, come up. And God provides a well, and God provides water, and God raises them up, and they end up back with her people, reconciles her back to her people. So under whatever tensions or means she left and or was taken away from Egypt, she finds her way back, and her son marries within her people, marries an Egyptian woman. And so he is there in place, and she's back with her family. And so Hagar's story becomes a story of loss, of reconciliation, of restoration. And she's gone through this whole journey, but comes through. And she's not even the right ethnicity. She's not the right person. She's a foreigner. She's an immigrant. She's a slave. She has nothing and very little status, very little to offer. But she's taken into this story, and she has retained her agency. Now, this story of Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, almost dying and being saved by God, precedes another story that you're probably more familiar with, if you were familiar at all with that story. In the next chapter, 22, we read the Akedah, or the binding of Isaac. And this is the famous story where Abraham goes to sacrifice his son at the bequest of God. But I want to just pause for a second and ask, where is Sarah? In great contrast to the story in chapter 21, where we have a mother who's interceding on behalf of her son and trying so hard to make things work. In the very next chapter, we have an absence of the matriarch. Sarah is gone, and she's gone for the rest of the story. We don't get anything more of Sarah. There's a lot of discussion theologically about where Sarah is, where she's gone. I think the most convincing, now knowing what we know, is that they fought over this, her and her husband, over this act, and she left. And Isaac also, he's silent and passive in the story, and he also disappears from the text for quite a while. And I'll talk next week about where he is and isn't in the text. Hopefully he is in some PTSD counseling. I'm just gonna throw that into the story and hope that he got a card for a good counselor. But Abraham hears this instruction from God. And also, for the first time since he decided to just follow his wife and take Hagar to his bed, he doesn't talk to God about this. So here's another time when God says to Abraham to do this thing, take your son, and whatever it means. There's many, many scholars, many ancient theologians who have tried to work out why this is happening. Some have come to the conclusion that this was an illusion. This was not actually God speaking. And Abraham couldn't converse with this idea because it wasn't from God. There are some people who think that this is a great test of faith from God, and God is trying to show once and for all that God does not have child sacrifice as part of the cultic worship of God in that time, which would have set itself up, which is an idea that would have set itself up against Molech and some of the gods in the nearby regions. There are some who say that this was an allegory for circumcision, that Abraham took Isaac to circumcise. That this is Sarah's version of the story, that she tells it. Abraham took my son and he could have died, and I'll never forgive him for that. So there's lots of different ways of interpreting this story. It is a very complicated story. It is the only time that we get any semblance that God might want human sacrifice as part of an act of worship. So it becomes a really complex part. In the end, the story sort of mirrors the story before with Hagar and Ishmael, in that Isaac almost dies, although it's not due to nature, it's due to an act of sacrifice, in that Hagar sort of abandons her son to death when he's near death, and Abraham is willing to abandon his son to death, although taking a more active role in that. And at the end of it, Abraham names God, just as Hagar first named God. Hagar named God El Roi. And in the end of the story, which you hopefully know by now, that God stops the sacrifice and says, now I know that you are in awe of me, and provided a ram instead of Isaac for Abraham to sacrifice an animal, which was more customary than sacrificing people. Abraham names God Yahweh Yirah, my provider, Yahweh, my provider. So this story has a lot of parallels. One of the interesting commentaries on this, I think, is that God says, what I've learned from you is that you fear me. And after that point, Abraham and God no longer converse. God does not speak to Abraham. Abraham does not speak with God. It ends. And so some people think that he failed the test, that he should have negotiated with God over the sacrifice of this promised son, just like he negotiated just a few chapters before for his brother Lot and his wife to be saved from Sodom and Gomorrah, for the righteous to be saved. And because he failed that test, but God learned that he feared God, that this was the consequence of it. And the consequence becomes silence. And so we no longer see Sarah or Isaac in the story, and Abraham has very little agency after this point. Genesis 21 and 22 both show a very traumatic story for a mother to lose a child. Both stories represent a threshold of pain for a mother. After Sarah fought so hard to become a mother, both of the outcomes of that, both Ishmael and Isaac, are both at risk to be lost in 21 and 22. Isaac is taken out to die, but his mother is not there to intercede.
Named Hagar the Egyptian, Sarah's servant, and she is the matriarch of the lineage that follows. And she becomes important in the Muslim Quran as Mother Hagar or Mother Hajar, and Muslims still practice a pilgrimage to Mecca where they reenact this story of Hagar's desperation as she searches for water and food. And so I think it's interesting that her story continues on in a highly religious context in the modern world. She has more in common with the ancient Hebrew people for the rest of the Bible than Sarah does, because starting in Exodus, when the Hebrew people become a nation, they are in a position just like Hagar, where they are wandering in the wilderness. They are seeking God. And so Hagar becomes a foreshadowing of God's compassion for people who are crying out in the wilderness. And so in these stories alone, in 21 and 22, Sarah, who stays silent, is sharply contrasted with Hagar, who cries out, as Sarah's own descendants will cry out in Exodus 2. And God will intercede on their behalf and save them. In Galatians, the Apostle Paul gives us a metaphor to think about these mothers as mountains as symbols of freedom in the covenant and enslavement in the covenant. But Genesis doesn't provide us a flat allegory for their stories. We get complex agency. We get their relationships with their families. We get their interactions with legal and ethical complexities of family life. While surrogacy is a normal way to procreate in the ancient Near East, social hierarchies can bring power, diversity, and structure and harm to relationship. And this is something that shows up really sharply in this very first family story that we have in the Old Testament. So we followed Sarah and Hagar through the thresholds of promised power, pain, and provision. Their stories are not tidy and they don't resolve neatly. But I think that's the point of when we think about covenant, which I think we often think about as religious people, like, what does that covenant mean for them? What does it mean for us today? And it's something that's talked about a lot in the New Testament. Covenant is not forged in certainty. It's forged in the complexity. And I think this feeds into the statement that doubt is not the opposite of faith. That doubt is not the opposite of faith. That the opposite of faith is certainty. If we have certainty, we don't need faith. But if we doubt and live in the complexities, then we need faith to carry us through to the next thing. And I think that's where scripture becomes a basis for us to see how faith can be lived out in a complex way, in a way and means that are shrouded by ambiguity, in a way that we might feel our lives are shrouded in ambiguity from where we've been. So in conclusion, Genesis is often read as a patriarchal epic, but today we've traced a deeper current, not through battles, but through two women, one who lives in a tent and one who thrives in the wilderness. Sarah and Hagar are not just characters in an old story, they are thresholds. Sarah shows us what it means to live with power and how easily fear can turn into control. Hagar shows us what it means to live on the margins and how God meets us despite that in the margins. Together they remind us that God hears what is silence, sees what is cast out, and does not fail in doing covenant work through people we least expect. So as you go into your week, I invite you to carry one question with you. Where are you standing? Are you inside the tent or in the wilderness? And who in your world is being unseen and unheard? Maybe this week covenant faith looks like listening harder. Maybe it looks like using your voice where others can't. And maybe it's just remembering you are seen, you are heard, and God will meet you wherever you are. Thank you.